Hello, welcome back to the Homegrown Nerds podcast.
With your hosts,
Ace Lambertus.
and Bryce Young.
Alrighty. So, today we are going to be talking about science fiction versus high fantasy, specifically high fantasy. So, to start us off, Bryce, would you go ahead and define for us what is sci-fi?
It's interesting you would ask that because science fiction has a hard time deciding what it really is. But generally what's accepted is the fact that it involves the future, usually with space exploration, with discovery of alien species, so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
But you'd be surprised how many subgenres that actually qualify as science fiction.
No, I don't know if I would be so surprised. You specifically said future. What about things like Star Wars that are said to be set in the distant past?
Well,
Would that still be considered sci-fi, or is that a subgenre of science fiction?
it is defined as a subgenre.
Just because it is not technically in the future?
Yeah, because the subgenre that would be categorized under would be space opera. And that's kind of like what Mass Effect was a
Yep.
space opera. So it kind of is cross between technology, future kind of stuff. Doesn't necessarily mean around here.
Yep. And for, I guess, isn't science fiction also defined kind of in that it's set in our universe with our rules?
It is based on the physics that we know of today. Yeah, I guess that would be the best way to explain it.
Yep. It has future technology, so to speak, but generally speaking, it sticks to the physics of our world and could even be set in our solar system.
Yes.
Or our galaxy.
Yeah, if it starts going into other things that doesn't involve technology or science, that's where we go into fantasy, which is what you would be talking about. So what's high fantasy?
High fantasy specifically is defined as being presented in a different world. It is generally to be found to be its own select area, select design, with different rules, different varying sets depending on who the author of this high fantasy world is. So, for instance, magic, wonky physics, things that square up differently. Anything can be defined in this world based on the author's own imagination. So it kind of sets, it's not set in our world, it's set in its own little bubble, if that makes sense.
Yeah, good example, Star Wars again.
Yes, Star Wars again. I know it's technically supposed to be in the distant past, but it's also set in a world all its own with kind of its own rules.
Yeah.
I think it still kind of tries to stick to a lot more of the science we know now, other than the Force. The Force is the differing factor. There is where things like midichlorians and all that kind of put a science-y spin on it.
Well, they even try to science the Force, too.
Yeah, like I said, that's the midichlorians.
Yeah.
That puts the science-y spin on it to kind of keep it in the sci-fi genre.
Yeah, but that was like some totally like a book written.
Yes, but in general, it more sticks to self. Sorry, not self. It more sticks to the rules of our universe, with the exception of the Force. So I would still consider it a sci-fi rather than a high fantasy.
Okay, but Star Wars is probably not the greatest example because it takes on both worlds of science fiction and high fantasy.
Yes, which might actually put it in the genre of low fantasy.
And what's low fantasy?
Low fantasy is defined as being set in our world, but having a wrench thrown in the works. Is the simplest way of putting it. Essentially, low fantasy is something like your Harry Potter, or I can't think of much more off the top of my head than the example of Harry Potter, but something that is set. Harry Potter is set in England, but magic exists.
And they try to convince you that it's part of the world that we cannot see.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, so that's more relatable, whereas high fantasy, like you said, is in its own bubble.
Yes. And to be more specific, high fantasy is set in a world apart. Low fantasy is set in our world, but with kind of the rules of high fantasy thrown on there. So it takes our world and kind of throws physics out the window.
Okay.
Does what it wants, essentially. Which is why I think Star Wars might fall a little bit more in the low fantasy category, as it is supposedly set in our world.
All right, fair enough.
But it has a bit of a wrench thrown in the works with the Force, as well as just kind of does its own thing with all its stuff. But I still lean on the side of it's more science fiction than low fantasy.
Well, even though that's the most probable case, it's still good in between, a good mix of fantasy and science fiction.
Yep.
So what's your clear definition of a fantasy?
Of a fantasy?
High fantasy, I mean.
Of high fantasy. My clear definition
there's no sci-fi in it whatsoever. What's a show that you know is like full-on high fantasy?
Lord of the Rings.
Best example.
Best example. The world of Middle Earth is set apart. Even if J.R.R. Tolkien generally defined it as being kind of an ancient part of this world, it's still considered a world apart.
It's accepted as
yes. And it has its own deities, its own powers. Magic exists. Its own countries, its own realms, its own races. And it holds itself apart in its own little bubble with its own ideas and definitions and set rulings on how things go. That is the epitome for me of a high fantasy, and it might be, some consider it to be close to the origins of high fantasy.
I take inspiration
as
from it.
A fantasy genre in and of itself.
Fair enough.
I mean, there were still tales of there were what were called fairy tales set before, but for the most part, generally most fiction set before was set in our world with then gods and deities superimposed on top of our world, or certain creatures or things superimposed on top of our world, making it low fantasy. Generally, before it was popularized by the Lord of the Rings, I think most things were low fantasy.
Well, to be honest, if you take all mythology and all that together, fantasy and high and low fantasy have been around throughout the ages
Yes.
of humanity's history.
Yep.
And it still has been more dominant and more engrossing, probably because of that fact.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And so it comes to being that it's a wide, long genre of storytelling and other such things. Sci-fi, where does sci-fi come in?
Sci-fi compared to fantasy is like a newborn baby. A lot of people tend to go to H.G. Wells. He was kind of the father in some cases. But even then, it had many other people down the line, even farther than that. I do recall.
Yep.
But H.G. Wells is most well known for it.
And what does H.G. Wells do?
Oh, he did. Oh, what did he do?
Quick look up.
Yeah, I'm looking.
Come on, find all his intellectual properties.
Well, I know for a fact that the States and Empires of the Moon, the States and Empires of the Sun, he's just done so many different things that involve sci-fi that I'm pretty sure like shows of Firefly, Stargate SG-1, everyone has samples from those from H.G. Wells' craft.
Mm-hmm. All right. And in the same breadth, I guess you could say H.P. Lovecraft also had a lot of high fantasy. His was closer to low fantasy because he liked to set things in our world, but generally his ideas stretched into the high fantasy.
Yeah, H.P. Lovecraft was definitely high fantasy, low fantasy, all the way over there.
Very fantastical. A little bit of an interesting question. Where do you put Frankenstein? Low fantasy or
fantasy.
Science fiction?
I think that would technically be low fantasy.
Yes.
Due to the fact that even though it has science in it, and you can consider it a science fiction, it's more accepted that it was a fiction of fantasy.
A fiction of fantasy.
Yes.
Okay.
It's more of an opinion thing, honestly.
Yep. It's just, where do you like to put something?
Yeah, and if I remember correctly, I did read it back in like high school. And from what I read from it, it doesn't really add a lot to the universe other than the relationship between man and monster.
Mm-hmm.
So the reason why it's more of a low fantasy is because it delves into the appropriation of or differentiation of man and monster.
Yes.
So that's why it's not really much for science fiction, but it's just up to your opinion.
Okay. I can agree to that.
Yeah, a good example would be the writings of Isaac Asimov, one of my all-time favorite science fiction writers. And he kind of took a Oh, he took a good whack at AI and artificial intelligence, the Star Wars, the space exploration. He made so many books upon that.
Hmm.
He's honestly my favorite science fiction writer. Even though it wasn't full on actual novels and stuff, all of it,
Mm-hmm.
he was still highly regarded as a sci-fi kind of guy.
Seems like he has a lot of short stories, a lot of movies that he's known for.
He's the one for iRobot, I believe.
Yep, he is. That is one of the main ones that comes up.
Yeah, and that's actually a full-on series if you guys want to check that out.
Yep. In any case, so what is a defining... I'll spin the question from earlier back on you. What do you... Like, what is your pinnacle science fiction? And then what is a intellectual property that matches that for you? That you enjoy.
It's just sci-fi, right?
Yes, just sci-fi.
Well, I was raised by my grandparents, so I'd have to actually say Star Trek.
Trekkie.
I'm not much for Trekkie, but I watched it and I enjoyed Next Generations. That's the one I watched.
So you didn't do...
I didn't do old
original.
school. I didn't do Gen 1, sorry.
Yeah, that's all right. I haven't watched much of those either. My dad kind of grew up watching Next Generation, I think. I think he watched a lot of Next Generation and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, it honestly was more down-to-earth sci-fi. It kind of spun more of a political aspect, and you had to think through stuff.
Yep.
Whereas Gen 1 was kind of a goofy show.
Yeah, from what I understand, it was kind of campy in that old style TV show where they hadn't squared away exactly how TV works.
Yeah.
And now they got it down too much to a formula that something needs to come in and wrench it.
I mean, Next Generation was pretty serious at times. It had its funny moments, but...
Yep. But it was definitely more serious than campy.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
More closer to the pinnacle TV show than original was.
Although I probably should say there is one that's high sci-fi, but kind of delves into low fantasy.
Low fantasy.
Yeah, this one's my example instead of Star Wars. And it's well known to everyone, especially in the UK, if you can guess it.
Doctor Who?
That a boy.
Yep. I would still consider that generally science fiction.
Yeah,
because it technically a lot of the stuff is set in the future, but it can also be set in the past. Time travel is a tricky one, but generally I would consider that a science fiction.
Oh yeah, that one's definitely science fiction, but it has those low fantasy moments.
It does have those low fantasy moments of whenever he visits Earth and just does what he does. Does what the Doctor does.
Yep. I still remember that episode where a Dalek was part of the, which war was it? I think it was World War II. Churchill?
Yep.
Yeah.
That's World War II.
Yeah, that was a interesting episode.
Exterminate. 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 Okay. So what really draws you in about science fiction?
Well, other than I'm a science lover, I'd have to say the possibilities.
The possibilities, they kind of tickle your fancy.
Yeah, because I'm all about possibilities also. And the reason why sci-fi tends to tickle me a bit is it has that possibility of actually being true. We're discovering new things every day that it seems closer and closer we're living the science fiction dream. I mean, as of recording this, I'm pretty sure 6 years from now or so, there's going to be colonists on Mars.
Yeah.
How
Very well possible. That would be cool.
Like, how crazy is that?
It's absolutely ridiculous.
Yeah, so I just like seeing what people can come up with for science fiction. It could be crazy, it could be cool, it could be awful, it could be sweet. It could be so many things. The imagination is just boom. Mind blown.
Yep.
What about you?
For me, are you talking about what I like about science fiction? Or
yeah, well, what's your opinion on science fiction?
What's my opinion on science fiction? I enjoy science fiction a lot. It definitely draws me in with its various possibilities. But to me, it takes a world that already has set definitions for physics and gives just enough truth to be conceivable with enough fiction thrown in to be fun. So to me, the fact that there's a nugget of truth in every story, some more than others, I should say, really holds true to some things that I like about character and world building, in that they take a concept, and instead of working against the physics of the world that we live in, they took the physics of the world that we live in and worked with them to create something fantastical. That's probably what draws me in about science fiction. It very much likes to tell a story within the universe, which is impressive, as well as very clean-cut, easily relatable. You don't have to think outside your box so far to the point of going, I have no idea if this is actually what the author is talking about. If someone tells you that a character in this world visits Mars, you have an idea of what Mars looks like. You've never been to Mars, you've never truly seen Mars, you may have seen pictures, but
no one's ever been there.
That is all you've seen of Mars, which means that if someone says that this person is on Mars, you have a general idea of, all right, I know what Mars looks like, at least to some extent.
Yeah.
And then they throw things into the mix, grind things up, and just go, good luck. To give an example, the Red Rising trilogy that we talked about the other day, that is, to me, very good science fiction, set across with just enough nuggets of technology to be considered true, with a little bit of low fantasy mixed in.
Got a little frosting on it, yeah.
Yeah. But it also is set in this world where there's Luna, Mars, they jump all around space. There's certain aspects that it's just, they've colonized the worlds, and Mars is the key one at this point. So it really it really helps build that world in my head that I can go, okay, Mars. Okay, red. Okay, here's what Mars can look like.
It pulls on the
Da-da-da.
recognition, like you said.
It pulls on that recognition, that already set definition of what Mars is. Dry, desolate, terrible. But it throws a wrench in those works. It changes it up by adding science and futuristic science to it. So, what about you in high fantasy?
High fantasy. Well, first off, I played D&D, so you know my opinion on that.
Yes. D&D is very much high fantasy. Can be low fantasy if you wanted it to be, but...
Excuse me. Well, my grip on high fantasy, I'd probably have to point it to mythologies.
No, I could see them. Some of mythology can come from high fantasy. A lot of it would be more low fantasy.
Well,
but I guess I got to thinking, and things like the different realms of the Norse mythology, or the different areas of Greek and Roman mythology, Hades versus Olympus, and other various areas of those mythologies. So I guess you could consider it to some extent to be high fantasy.
yeah.
In that they play around either on Olympus or in Hades, but they do reach to what is the world of that time, or what they understood of the world at that time.
Yeah. Though the way I'm speaking of mythologies and stuff, the way I would more explain why I like it is you have... Let's go with Middle Earth.
Okay.
Everyone knows Lord of the Rings. Everyone knows it. The reason why I enjoy that is because it's so rich in mythology, lore, and history that I want to explore what that place is. I want to see what stories came to be, why that mountain is called the Lonely Mountain, and why no one goes to it. For sci-fi, me, possibility. High fantasy, what happened. Those are kind of the things that separate why I like high fantasy and why I like sci-fi.
Yep. The difference in your in what you're going to them for. You're not going to both for the same reason. Some people can and some people do, but for the most part, people generally have a reason they drift towards high fantasy or sci-fi. When they're feeling an inkling for sci-fi, there's a reason, as opposed to why they couldn't just watch something that's high fantasy.
But like I said, the possibility with sci-fi is just almost infinite, and you want to see those possibilities. With high fantasy, for me, I want to see the histories of what happened and who these people were.
Yep.
So I guess for me, I like to see the future for sci-fi, and with high fantasy, I like to see the past for what happened. I guess that's the general way I'd do it.
Okay.
What about you?
For me, with high fantasy, I really like the adventurous spirit and the imaginative. The idea of creating your own world, building it up from the ground up, locations, somewhat to what you said with understanding the past. But to me, it's also almost an escape. It's a world set apart that I can delve into that is not my own and understand what the author has defined as specific traits of their world. So, for instance, going back to Lord of the Rings, the Silmarillion, which I have not read, sadly.
We will get eventually.
That is one that I will, that I have been inkling to do an audiobook on, just to listen to it when I got time. Anyway, the Silmarillion delves into the past of Lord of the Rings, really tearing apart the lore of the one and then all the beings below it, going up to how Sauron came about, who he is, who he was, the different battles throughout history, bloody and terrible, how the elves got there, how the elves plan to leave there, is a mythology for a mythological world.
Yeah.
And Tolkien originally looked at it as what he could consider kind of a mythology for Western Europe, is what he started out, kind of his ideology for his hope for the series was that it could eventually be something along the lines of a mythology for Western Europe.
Oh, yeah.
And
it worked.
He kind of succeeded, as everything is set in everything, maybe not everything, a lot of things that are defined by high fantasy tend to, your mind immediately jumps to ancient Western Europe. Maybe not ancient, but medieval Western Europe.
There you go.
Now, there are sci-fi high fantasy worlds.
Oh,
but
yeah.
And there are a lot of those. But generally, when you talk high fantasy, your mind immediately jumps to medieval Europe. Swords, knights, men in armor, things like that. So I really like that aspect of just having created a world. I really like sci-fi for playing in a world that already exists, and I really like high fantasy for really taking a world and building it from the ground up, creating its own rules, creating its own ideas, what it likes to be as a thing, and then working within its own limits to tell its own story. And so it's the exploration of what this new world is that is kind of intriguing and tickles that itch. You're always finding something new, something different, a change from the norm, an escape from this world into a different one. Once again, going back to Tolkien, he talked about fairy tales once upon a time. He had an essay that was sort of published. It's not too long, about an hour's worth of listening if you listen to an audiobook of it. But it talks about how the fairy tales are not just for children, about how fairy tales are for men and women to enjoy a story. And as we popularized the land, we kind of got away from fairy tales because we realized that there was not enough room in this world for dwarves or fairies or elves or
Dragons.
So that's why things started getting smaller and smaller. You start to think, some people started to think of elves in the short little stubby elves with pointed ears, but shorter. The same with dwarves. They were always short, but they slowly got shorter. Fairies, sometimes they used to be like quite large, but they generally shrunk down to the size of something minuscule, something that could hide behind a blade of grass. Because as we colonized the worlds, we realized that there was no room for such things, which is when people started to looking to a world outside of our own. People started looking to the stars, the universe, extraterrestrial life, for that itch of the fairy tale, while others looked to different worlds for that itch of the high fantasy characters.
Mm-hmm.
So, and both are defined by sort of an escapism from the now.
Yeah, that's fair enough.
From the mundane. You enjoy the story not because it's true, but because it's false. Because it is a fairy tale. So I've talked quite a while. So
you were very engrossed, so I do not blame you.
Sorry. Let's bring it back. What kind of main intellectual properties do you like that are involved in science fiction? You've mentioned a couple in Star Trek and Mass Effect. The ones that I can think of off the top of my head would be Interstellar, the movie, more recent ones. So the one where Matt Damon goes to Mars, The Martian.
Yeah, I didn't see that movie.
I didn't see it either, but I heard it was very good. And my friend recommended me the book, and I think I'm going to go ahead and get that and listen to it. Because it's pretty well, from what I understand, it's pretty good when it comes to actual science.
Yeah, because he used his own feces to plant crops.
Yeah.
You could do that.
It was amazing how many scientists stepped up, at least for the movie, and said, yeah, this is conceivable. There are some things that are thrown in that are not something we can conceive of yet, but for the most part, it was conceivable. So those are pretty good. Anything else you can think about that are...
Oh, there's so many nowadays.
Yeah. Science fiction is a lot more prominent
than
high fantasy nowadays.
Although high fantasy's been grabbing been grabbing from the hole it came from, and now it's starting to gravel its way up. I don't know where I'm going with that analogical.
Yeah. I get what you're saying, though. You're saying that it's coming for a resurgence.
Yes, resurgence. That's what it was.
Yep.
So, let's see. I know I said Stargate, SG-1. I don't think many people remember that show.
I do.
Do ya?
Yeah.
What kind did you watch?
I do not remember. I only remember my dad watching some Stargate. and it being very interesting. I don't know if it was the old Stargate or the newer Stargate. I can't remember.
The older Stargates, I'm not going to be that guy. I was going to call it superior, but everyone has their own niche. Oh, excuse me. Everyone has their own little show they like to watch. So I'm not going to shame anybody for not going to the original.
Mm-hmm.
Because the original is actually a movie, believe it
Really?
or not. Yeah, I believe. Yes, it was definitely a movie. And from there, it basically gone from this weird artifact that the government's holding all of a sudden starts up.
Mm-hmm.
They don't know what's going to happen. All of a sudden, little water effects, CGI happens and makes a person come out of it. Couple people. They're obviously human looking, not just because budget reasons, but it showed that they are both different but similar.
Mm-hmm.
And those first ones to make contact with humanity on Earth was the Goa'uld.
That's a mouthful. Goa'uld.
Yeah, it's very interesting their culture, but continuing on with what was going on, they kidnap a researcher, and a team are sent to go rescue them.
Mm-hmm.
Yada, yada, yada. They fight, they come home, and now they're using that Stargate to go to different worlds.
Mm.
And the amount of worlds they go through and the amount of worlds that come to them is a lot more bigger than you'd expect. And there's they have a lot of cool journeys, a lot of cool characters. Even one of the soldiers of the Goa'uld, they actually come and join the human team, the Earthlings.
Ah. Okay.
That's the simple version, but I highly suggest checking it out.
Gotcha. So, well, for me, changing gears to higher fantasy, I've already said Lord of the Rings. And that's really the primary high fantasy one that exists nowadays. I guess you could consider Game of Thrones high fantasy.
That's high fantasy, yeah.
I am part of the 1% that has never seen an episode of Game of Thrones.
That makes two of us.
Yay! But intellectual properties, as in Dungeons and Dragons, some various book series is here and there. Enjoy the high fantasy aspects of it, as well as a lot of manga and anime. Generally delve into the realm of high fantasy.
Yeah, they've really delved into that.
More towards the Edo period of samurai and ninja and stuff like that, but still that idea of high fantasy world with some sci-fi high fantasy as well.
Yeah, but high fantasy is more prominent than sci-fi.
Yes.
In anime and mangas, I should say.
Yes. Very much a world apart from our own. Very good stuff comes from those. One Piece is good. As well as Naruto was a thing. It exists. I've completed it, but I don't feel any better about it. I never watched all the anime. I hit the manga, and I had to complete it because I had already started it.
Yep.
And I did it, and I did not touch the anime. I had watched some episodes once upon a time, but there was too much filler for me. Anyway, that is a discussion for another day.
Yes.
So those, it surprises me that a lot of high fantasy that I can think of actually comes from like cartoons or anime or manga.
Mm-hmm.
I guess it makes sense in that movies and TV shows, it's easy to set a station in a world that already exists, and that there's already set locations that you can film in or set locations that you can visit. It's very easy to pull from those, wherein things like cartoons or anime or animated movies or CGI movies, you can very much more pull into that fantastical world of differing physics and strange the set apart, the bubble world. So it makes it easier to do. It's interesting how that works. We're starting to get to the point where our CGI can definitely start building high fantasy worlds, but it's expensive.
For now.
But even a CGI movie is still probably considered animated or so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
There can be some live acting with some set props, but for the most part, it's still mostly animated.
And speaking of that, I think in retrospect to that, sci-fi is a lot harder to pull off than fantasy anymore. Wouldn't you say?
Yeah.
Because fantasy, you can literally make up something right on the spot.
Yes.
Whereas sci-fi, you gotta do some research.
Yes.
And more research. Make a little bend here, a little bend there. Got a mannequin, yada yada.
Yep, you gotta take an already built world, and it's part of the, as I said earlier, part of the appeal of science fiction to me is writers have done their research. They do enough research to get enough nuggets of truth to build a fictional world on.
Mm-hmm. But that always takes time, and not everyone has time, so fantasy's kind of the easy way.
Yeah, the easy out
Mm-hmm.
is just creating a world where, yeah, that exists. Rather than going, this exists
Because
this. Or even just not saying it exists, but still being conceptually conceivable is important in science fiction.
Yeah.
You have to be able to conceive of something that could do it, even if it couldn't actually work. You have to be able to conceive that, all right, yeah, spaceship, fly quick.
Thrusters
Gotcha.
go boom.
Exactly. Some sort of reactor. I don't know how it works, but
Let's press a few buttons and it'll work for us. Don't worry.
beep boop bop boop beep boop bop boop.
Oh, hey, it worked.
Exactly.
Oh, the amount of times I've seen that, though.
Yes. Space travel is something we haven't gotten down to a science, so any space travel or space exploration is primarily sci-fi. Things like Hitchhiker's Guide to the Universe.
I still need to read that, though.
The newer movie is pretty good. I've seen the newest movie.
Okay.
I think it's the newest movie.
I have no idea. Either way, I need to either read it or watch it.
I should have you watch it because it has that very much dry British humor that it's very...
The only humor I can actually laugh at.
Yes. I am pretty close to the same way. Something about British humor just scratches that itch.
Yeah, I saw you with the finger.
Yes. It's very good.
But bringing it back.
Yeah, bring it back. It's. I think you are right with the sci-fi being a little bit harder than high fantasy, but high fantasy isn't either. You have to be able to conceive of a world that is conceivable. You have to be able to conceptualize things that could be conceived of. Same, different way of putting what I just said. You have to build upon your own rules. You're starting from the bottom with a base in our own world, because that is what is observable. But even with the base of our own world, to create your own world, you have to define histories. What happened when, where, why. Battles that took place in the past. How was this world created? Where did it come from? Where is it going?
I think the reason why I have an easier time with coming up with worlds and stuff for fantasy, it doesn't help that I'm very creative.
Yes. With fantasy, it's very imaginative.
Yes.
Very imaginative. You have to very much pull from all your
resources.
All your mental resources.
Yeah.
In order to build a world.
Believable world.
A believable world.
Yeah.
Which kind of brings us around to low fantasy, because and here's my segue. As I said, it's easier to conceive of a world where you have a base already, which is where sci-fi has a bit of an easy time. But low fantasy takes it a step further, in where sci-fi, you have to have a conceptualized idea that has a nugget of truth in it, at least to some extent. Instead of having to be conceivably conceivable, it is merely you take the base already that has happened and you throw something in.
Right.
As I said before, take Harry Potter. You take a world that already exists, 19-somethings, British, England, and you add magic into the mix. And then you set the world in Scotland and other areas. But for the most part, they stay on Scottish Isle, I believe. I don't think they ever leave Britain.
Don't ask me much. I only watched movies, so I can't give you details.
I don't know. Anyway, but it's easier to conceive of. It's simpler in its base. You already have a base to work from, and if you have an idea that kind of twists things, then you can kind of pull all that together, which is why I think low fantasy is a lot more popular and prominent, as it is easier to conceive of, easier to get people to conceive of, and then easier to write, direct, work with, whatever you want for your intellectual property. Things like comics, comic book movies, a lot of different genres nowadays. Things like the show Merlin that came out a while ago that was very popular.
I'm actually watching that too.
All of these are low fantasy. They're any of the Marvel movies I would consider low fantasy.
Oh, definitely.
Because they're fantastical, kind of sci-fi, but for the most part, they're set in a world where
you can be
Earth exists. Here's Earth. Here's what we knew of Earth. And suddenly a spanner is thrown in, and everything goes to whatever.
Hey, look at this guy. He can go subatomic. Now you're definitely in a fantasy realm then.
Yes. At that point, you're straight in a fantasy. A dude turns into a giant green beast. You're in low fantasy.
Oh,
you're in a
definitely.
fantastical realm.
So fantasy still has a foothold on humanity.
Yes, exactly. Low fantasy, I don't think has ever gone away or will ever go away.
It never will.
As long as humanity has a fascination with art or just anything outside of themselves, there will be low fantasy, because there's always that question of what if this, what if that, and then it builds upon itself to create a world of pure imagination.
That's low fantasy Willy Wonka right there.
Yep. Pure imagination. And so I think, in conclusion, coming to a close, each one has their place: high fantasy, low fantasy, sci-fi.
And sci-fi is a subgenres, which we never even talked about.
Yes.
That'll be another time. Because that's a lot of stuff there.
Yes, there's a lot to unpack there. Any final thoughts from you?
No matter where you look, either to the stars or to the earth, there's always a story, whether it be a fantasy or sci-fi.
I agree with that.
Look for the possibilities, find that history, and just keep reading and writing.
Yeah, I think that's perfect.
Yep, that's all I got.
So we'll end there.
Yep. Have a lovely day.
Bye.